Travis Wayne Gazelle. So, you paying attention to Armageddon news? You're not relying on just one source for your information? The Gaza hospital that was bombed. If you hear it from Hamas, they blame Israel. Obviously, it's what they do. And thus the Palestinians believe Hamas and their version of events. And so the whole world of Islam are now outraged, blaming Israel for the bombing of a hospital. The Jews, however, did their investigation and found that it was a Palestinian Islamist jihad that had purposely fired at the hospital to incite what happened among the whole world of Islam. And perfectly timed it with the arrival of President Biden. This is Terrorist Tactics 101. Do a false flag operation, blame someone else for the specific purpose of inciting the mob to act out in violence. And so America is on heightened alert for hate crimes of terrorist nature by Islam. All Islam refused to accept the fact that Hamas started the fight. This fight. They started it. They started all fights, but people refuse to accept origin causation when you're a terrorist, when you're a criminal, etc. And so blaming other people is a common tactic of the enemy and getting them in trouble for it, so that you, as the terrorist, can rise up and take over. Right, Brigham Young? The Book of Mormon, 1 Nephi, chapter 1, verse 2, tells us, it's in the learning of the Jews, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints refuses to footnote that. They refuse to teach us the learning of the Jews, unless it's specifically covered in the Book of Mormon, as they purposely mislead and miseducate Mormons to believe that the Jewish prophecies of a Christ is not the Jewish version of a Christ, but Christian Jesus created by Roman Emperor Constantine. And thus, why are we called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints again, Brigham Young? The New Testament was not written by Christians. They were written by Jews too. So it's supposed to be the Jewish Christ. So when you read in the Gospels about a character named Jesus, it's not Jesus as a person who came to earth immaculately conceived by his mother Mary, and then had dealings with the Pharisees, violating the hedge laws, and then was murdered by the Jews. The Great and Abominable Church is a repetitive pattern prophecy. It's a human behavior of wickedness. And so the Babylonians were the Great and Abominable Church. John, for example, uses Babylon to describe the Great and Abominable Church of the latter days as the whore. And then you have the Greeks. They're the great and abominable church too, especially when you talk about Hanukkah of the Jews, that the Maccabean revolt resulted in taking back the temple from the Greeks and establishing their temple rituals, no longer sacrificing the big pig too. Timon and Pumbaa. And then the Romans, great and abominable church. And notice that these are all towards the Jews. Even Christianity is the great and abominable church to the Jews. Islam, great and abominable church to the Jews. Muhammad claiming to be the prophet who went to the top of the mountain and received the law called the Quran. He was replacing the man like Moses. He was presenting himself as Antichrist of the Jewish Christ. And so likewise, Brigham Young, following that same tactic, because it's worked so well, the highest population of the world are Christians and Islamists. And so we've got a 9/11 alert coming. Just to warn you, because nobody else will. Joseph Smith warns of a 9/11 attack. Section 64 of the Doctrine and Covenants was given on 9/11. Joseph Smith's second vision was 9/22, repeated twice, 4 times. When Nephi, not Moroni, came to Joseph Smith on the 21st, which was in the evening, which means the Jewish calendar makes it the 22nd. So 4 times on the 22nd, and then said, come back every year 4 times. Joseph Smith is encoding a message to us in our day, because he's talking about our Christ, which comes from the law of the Jews, Deuteronomy. And so 9/11 is coming up in the Jewish religious calendar on Black Friday, right after Thanksgiving. So be on the alert for that. Friday is also the day when Islam has their special prayer that includes Muhammad's words of a day of judgment, which we have now reported in the news that Hamas and now Hezbollah also are calling a day of rage. They are the ones that are going to cause the day that shall burn as an oven. And Joseph Smith added to Malachi's prophecy for the latter days, they that come shall burn them. And again, Jewish prophecy is multiple fulfilled, but there's often a main dualistic fulfillment. In this particular case, the war in Israel is the Christian prophecy. That's what they're looking for. And so Christians believe this is now the start of Armageddon. But they're going to be deceived because it's a trap. They're going to destroy Christianity. Christians are not aware of this, that Albert Pike had plotted this as the group that he was a part of, that was back even further, that Brigham Young himself branched off from. Why do you think there's an inverted pentagram on the keystone of the doors of the Salt Lake Temple? It's because of this group that have been plotting this attack for 200 years. But Albert Pike, that was his whole intentions, to get Islam to turn on the Zionists. And so the news last night, I saw they were graffitiing property in which Islam was saying that Zionists must die. So prophecy of Albert Pike is being fulfilled of Christians. And so the other part of the dualism is Joseph Smith warning Mormons, specifically in the second vision, that Utah is also in jeopardy because Utah became the land where Brigham Young settled after fleeing America and then being taken hostage by the United States. That's how he saw it. He was pissed. He wanted his kingdom back. That was taken the very next year. That's why he was trying to create the state of Deseret with the Deseret coin and the Deseret language to be a coding so that the United States wouldn't know what he was up to. Deseret alphabet. And so the Jewish Christ from Deuteronomy 18, 15 through 19 that Joseph Smith refers to and says he's our Christ too is a human being. A man who will fulfill the law about him. Prophecy. All of the Jewish scriptures are prophecies. Not a single one of them are literal history. They refer to specific historical time periods. They refer to specific names of people, but you need to know Hebrew to know the baby name meanings. Otherwise, you're going to miss a lot of the prophecies that they're prophesying about with your Christian blinders. And so Joseph Smith tells Mormons that their Christ, who is the learning of the Jews, Book of Mormon, 1 Nephi chapter 1, verse 2, which means the Book of Mormon, not literal history. It's just like the Jewish scriptures of the Bible. They are prophecies of the latter days and the prophesied Christ, a man like Moses, whom Joseph Smith, section 103, verse 16, says will be a Mormon born and raised in Brigham Young's great and abominable church to save Mormons from the great and abominable church. And so, yeah, I've been doing all these videos for you. I'm having to repeat it. We're at 13 minutes already just for an introduction. As Islam is set up to attack Utah. They are perfectly positioned with their Islamic centers to strike against Utah. They're capable of reading the Book of Mormon, Mormons. You can't tell them that you're just like them. Even with the church's pamphlet saying, hey, we're Islam too. Islam is the religion, Muslim is the culture. And so the church has separated us from our culture as Mormons by taking away the cultural activities during the week, but yet trying to convince Islam that we're still a cultural group as Mormons, just like them. No, they're not dumb. Islamists are well educated. They just use the Quran to justify committing crime under the guise of the will of Allah. And so they can read 1 Nephi chapter 1, verse 2. They have an eternal hatred towards the Jews. And there the Book of Mormon says it's the learning of the Jews. And so, yes, they're well aware that the church claims to be Christian with Jesus, not Jewish with the Jewish Christ. And so thus they see the hypocrisy of Mormons. And so Mormons are even worse than the Jews in the sight of Islam, because they're deceiving the world when actually they're Jews, which is beyond hypocritical. It's the church ashamed and embarrassed to be Jewish, and so they call themselves Christian, so that they can be accepted in society. But anyway, the Jewish law. So in the Book of Mormon, Nephi gets the brass plates, and they find that the 5 books of Moses are in there, as written. It's not literal history, remember? Who had to rewrite the 116 pages? Well, you'd have to do your research or watch my videos, and believe me when I tell you and go over the evidence that it's Joseph Smith Sr. He was a Jewish Kabbalist in Vermont and was a Master Mason of the York Rites Freemasonry, which has the Knights Templar in it. So the Egyptian gold plates, the coming of a bloodline Christ, the United States as the New Jerusalem. Yeah. Joseph Smith Sr. was able to teach his son, Junior, all about this, but had to rewrite the 116 pages because of the loss of the 116 pages under Joseph Jr.'s guard. He was supposed to babysit Martin Harris to make sure that he would still pay, but Martin Harris insisted on being a part of it. Ruining everything. People are trying to murder them, and Martin Harris is throwing on a wrench in the cog. And so, the 5 books of Moses are not the law. Only Deuteronomy is the law. Deuteronomy, translated into English, means repetition of the law. It is not a repetition of the book of Exodus. Exodus is not the law. Exodus is Exodus. But notice what is contained in Deuteronomy, which we'll get to in just a minute. And so then the rest of the Book of Mormon goes and talks about an Exodus pattern. Exodus pattern, 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 all the way through the Book of Mormon. Not a coincidence. Senior knows what he's doing. He was the one who helped William Morgan work on the book, because William Morgan didn't know how to write a book to encode it, to be a warning, so that the enemy couldn't figure it out. They did, and they joined Joseph's church, and then overthrew it, couped it, murdered them, and took it over, and kidnapped women, sex trafficked them to the valley here, and now in chaos and pandemonium as they used your tithing money, which section 119 is for priestcraft. What did you think paying the priesthood means? And the first presidency debts? And so apparently the first presidency gets paid with the priestcraft money, and then the first presidency can go over budget if they want, and then just charge it to the members. Isn't that comfy? So how much does it cost to live in your home, Nelson? There in the hills of Bountiful? Oh, it's valued at $1 million, is it? Irene, yours? Oh, got it. And it increased with the Bountiful Temple. And so among these Exodus patterns, we see a repeating pattern of referring to the law of Moses, which is Deuteronomy. And so 1 Nephi chapter 4, Nephi goes back to get the brass plates. And they're concerned that, we got to get the brass plates. Laban isn't giving them up. We're trying to buy them. He won't sell. Won't give them up. And so it's important to know your Deuteronomy when you're reading the Book of Mormon. And so 1 Nephi 4:15, Nephi is talking about Nephi heard these words. He remembered the words of the Lord which he spake unto him in the wilderness. Reference Deuteronomy, saying, inasmuch as thy seed shall keep my commandments, they shall prosper in the land of promise. That's Zion, New Jerusalem, America. And so where does Nephi, Lehi, the Jaredites end up after their exodus? America. Not a coincidence. And so he also thought that he could not keep the commandments of the Lord according to the law of Moses, save they should have the law of Moses, Deuteronomy. They knew that the law was engraven upon the plates of brass. 1 Nephi 17:22. For they kept the statutes and judgments of the Lord and all his commandments according to the law of Moses. You need to know your Deuteronomy. Repeated in 2 Nephi 5:10 and 2 Nephi 25:24. Notwithstanding, we believe in Christ. Who's Christ? The Jewish Christ. Deuteronomy 18:15 through 19. From the law. We keep the law of Moses, of the man like Moses, who is the Christ, looking forward with steadfastness unto Christ until the law shall be fulfilled. The law is prophecy, and it contains a prophecy of the identity of the Christ in the learning of the Jews for the latter days. And so 2 Nephi chapter 3 verse 5 talks about Joseph Smith and the Mormon, who would be the Christ in the learning of the Jews, a man like Moses. And so you're supposed to look for an Exodus pattern for Armageddon. You're supposed to be looking for the man like Moses to sue the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And in that same year, creeping death will appear. And there will be the 3 days of darkness of solar eclipses during that time frame. We just had number 2. And it was over Utah. As well as the parting of the waters and the ability for Mormons to pass through on dry ground to head on the 70 to get to Zion in southern Illinois, not Missouri. And so if you're going, well, wait a minute, that never happened. Is it going to happen? No, you missed it because you had Christian blinders on. This is a great tragedy that is occurring for the latter days. It's all about you, Mormons, and you missed it. And so when Joseph Smith warns you specifically, saying, hearken to your Christ, or the earth will be utterly wasted at his coming. when you read about Ether writing about the utter destruction of the Jaredites, having to live in a cave, when you read about Moroni, who's all alone because of the utter destruction of the Nephites. Senior knew of this potential threat to you, Mormons. All you had to do was look for one of your own who follows the Exodus pattern. They gave you the dates. You just have to accept that astronomy is a field of science. And know that the Book of Mormon, 1 Nephi chapter 1, verse 8, comes from Revelation chapter 12, verses 1, 2, and 5. You go to the Joseph Smith translation of that passage, and verse 5 gets moved to verse 3, just like in the Book of Mormon. And then you realize that Lehi's second vision there is the exact same pattern match with Joseph Smith's second vision. And so where does he talk about the date? He talks about the Urim and Thummim, which Abraham used to look at the signs in the heavens. The date was 2017, the start of the latter days. And all Mormons could have known. There's a woman who does YouTube videos for the church. She's not authorized, but she's popular. Jody something. She knows of the sign in the heavens, has been doing the videos telling Mormons, but she has no clue what she's talking about. And she also has to defend the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So she lies. And so Mormons were supposed to see that sign coming because China made t-shirts. I bought one after I had found it. I searched Amazon to see if there was a t-shirt on it. Sure enough, there was. And there was one for this solar eclipse as well. They didn't have it connected to Revelation or the other Bibles or other stories in the Bible. Samson, for example, he prophesied of it. The death of his first wife by fire. But you got to know the learning of the Jews to see it. Because if you use Christian blinders, you don't see it. You think it's literal history that Samson was real and had superhuman strength. You miss the whole point of him being blinded, which is symbolic of solar eclipses, as well as lunar eclipses too. But he's the sun king. Shemesh, sun. And at the end is a suffix determinative for king, if you're a person, kingdom, if you're a place. Because you're looking for a Christ who knows Paleo-Hebrew and the learning of the Egyptians in the language of the Egyptians, not the learning of the Greeks in the language of the Egyptians. The learning of the Jews that the Book of Mormon talks about in the language of the Egyptians, that's still Egyptian. Because the Jews, pre-captivity Babylon, were Egyptian. They were tributary to Egypt. And so King David was not an independent nation of Israel. He was Pharaoh David Moses of the 18th dynasty of Egypt. So, this is who you're supposed to put in here, Mormons, to decode the prophecies. Your Christ is the Mormon. And you are told to look for him because he's going to warn you to save your lives. It's not just a matter of listening to him and being entertained, because I'm sure he's hilarious. Not like me, I'm boring. I put babies to sleep with my tone. And so verse 30 gives Nephi 25. Keeps it going. You must keep the performances and ordinances of God until the law shall be fulfilled. This was purposely done for the Jews so that they keep remembering of his coming. They are types and shadows of his coming. And it's supposed to help the Jews recognize who he will be. And unfortunately, they're missing it. They're not looking for a Mormon to be the guy. Because he's not to preach to the Jews. If they hear and they believe, great. But that's not his mission. His mission is only to Mormons. And so the symbolisms of the prophecies says that he will start his ministry in Utah. Judah, phonetically the same. And so the holy prophets believed in Christ, worshiped the Father in his name. And also we worship the Father in his name. What's the name of the Father? What's the name of the Son? Son, Amen. Father, Amen. That's what Isaiah is referring to as his name. So when Matthew writes his book, or technically the author of Matthew, they used AKAs, nom de plumes. He starts off in the beginning. I am going to be talking about Jesus. And he quotes from Isaiah of the prophecy of the name Emmanuel. Does not say Isaiah. Because Jesus is the reverse of Isaiah. Yah of salvation is Jesus. Salvation of Yah is Isaiah. And so he tells us, I am talking about the fulfillment of the Jewish Christ in the future. Not during the Roman period time. Not during the time he wrote about this after the Jews were destroyed. The temple destroyed. He's talking about a future person still yet to come in the Gospels. In Matthew, in this particular case. And you're supposed to know that his actual name is Emmanuel, not Jesus. And so likewise, all the stories of the Jews, even though they have different names for the heroes, they're all about Emmanuel. That's his name. And Emmanuel is El. That's used as a suffix determinative in this particular case for God. And Amen, which is a phonetic transliteration from Egyptian, meaning sun god at noonday. And so, wow, yeah, Lehi, who comes to see him? The sun god at noonday. Gives him a book. Talks about the destruction. Exodus. Man like Moses. Lehi becomes the man like Moses. Joseph Smith. Who comes to see him? Emmanuel, sun god at noonday. A light appeared in my room above the brightness of the sun at noonday. Gives him a book. Talks about the prophecies of the latter days. Talks about the Christ, the man like Moses, but refers to Acts instead of Deuteronomy. You're supposed to look it up. You're not just supposed to say, oh, it's precisely as it is in Acts. Oh, okay, so it's cut off. You've got to look it up. He purposely wrote it so that you would look it up. So in the Book of Mormon, Jesus comes and then tells the Nephites, I'm him. This is the latter days. I'm the Jewish Christ, who's Emmanuel, but I'm called Jesus. Nope. He's quoting from Acts, not Deuteronomy. Interesting. And there's some differences from Acts. You need to pay attention to those differences. And so for this intent, we keep the law of Moses. This is Jacob chapter 4, verse 5. It pointing our souls to him. Because it's prophecy about him. That's why the Jews need to keep the holy days as recorded. Because it is symbolic of him, their Christ. And so you need to keep the law of Moses until he comes. Until it's fulfilled. It'll help you identify him. And then Mormons have extra scriptures by Joseph Smith to help you identify him. And then Jacob chapter 7. We have an antichrist doing battle with Jacob, Sherem. The wording is interesting and needs to be paid attention to here. I've heard and also know that thou goest about much preaching what ye call the gospel or the doctrine of Christ. It's supposed to be about the tale of the God. That's the gospel. The doctrine of Christ from the law of Moses. The man like Moses. And ye have led away much of this people that they pervert the right way of God and keep not the law of Moses. So this is Sherem saying this. He's accusing Jacob of preaching what he calls the gospel and the doctrine of the Christ, leading away the people to pervert the law of Deuteronomy about the Christ. So Sherem is saying it's not the learning of the Jews. Some other Christ interpretation. And convert the law of Moses into the worship of the Jewish learning of a being which you say shall come many 100 years hence. Future prophecy of the Jewish Christ. Now behold, I, Sherem, declare unto you that is blasphemy. Who calls the learning of the Jews blasphemy, Christians? Who? Who is your Christ that replaced the man like Moses? Or we can even say Islam. And here's an interesting one, because the Ten Commandments is Babylonian influenced. Give you a hint, it's the Sabbath day. And even the Festival of Weeks, celebrated by the Jews, is Babylonian influenced, because the Babylonians were the first ones to create weeks, 7 days in a week specifically. The Egyptian calendars were just days constituting a month period, which could be broken down into weeks of 10 days, but doesn't matter. Just so that you understand, when you see the Sabbath day, the seventh day of rest, that's Babylonian. And so they kept the law of Moses and the Sabbath day holy unto the Lord. The Egyptians, every day was a holy day unto the Lord. And the temples were opened every single day. Just so that you know the difference. But that's what the Jews are doing, is they're keeping a Sabbath day according to the Babylonian corruption of the writing of the particular author of Genesis and the other books of the law of Moses. Because yes, Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 specifically, uses the Sabbath day, which is a Babylonian corruption in the text. Mosiah chapter 12, verse 29, we teach the law of Moses. And then asks, if you teach the law of Moses, why do you not keep it? And so yeah, another Antichrist who keeps saying, I follow the law of Moses. I'm not wicked. Laman and Lemuel, as we read earlier, we're saying that the Jews kept the law of Moses. They aren't wicked. Why are we going on an exodus? Why are we leaving Utah to go to Zion in southern Illinois? Murmur, murmur, murmur. Complain, complain, complain. And so yes, Mormons, if you believe in the commandments and ordinances of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, why aren't you keeping them? Committing all sorts of crimes. You set your heart on riches. You spend your time with harlots. Why do you cause this people to commit sin? That's Brigham Young right there. Tithing forces Mormons to commit crime. And what was the crime? Sex trafficking. Harlots. Whoredoms. And so technically this is number 6 of anti-polygamy. 6 times now, the Book of Mormon preaches against polygamy and the use of tithing to enforce polygamy. Section 119 with Section 132. Both forged documents by Brigham Young blaming Joseph. Mosiah 13. I say unto you, nay, for if ye had, the Lord would have caused me to come forth and to prophesy evil concerning this people. And now ye have said that salvation cometh by the law of Moses. I say unto you that it is expedient that you should keep the law of Moses as yet. But I say unto you that the time shall come when it shall no more be expedient to keep the law of Moses. Only the Christ of the latter days will give the millennial law. And it's a taskmaster. Oh, I wouldn't want to be him. Force you into bondage. Take away your agency. Make you pay tithing. Priestcraft, right? Because again, the enemy loves to do false flags and blame the other side who are innocent for the purpose of raising up a mob against them. And Alma 25. For they did keep the law of Moses, Deuteronomy, for it is expedient that they should keep the law of Moses, for it was not all fulfilled. Christ hadn't come yet. Notwithstanding the law of Moses, they did look forth for the coming of the Christ, considering that the law of Moses was a type of his coming. Yep. Exodus pattern that I just went over with you. Sues the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Warns of creeping death. And creeping death comes. Signs in the heavens. And parting of the waters for Mormons to pass through on dry ground at the Green River interchange where they're supposed to meet, and then head off on the I-70 to southern Illinois. Oops. And so even though their outward performances in the holy day festivals, it is symbolic as prophecy to identify who he is. So you need to know your Jewish holy days of Passover and Yom Kippur and Sukkot, which is the last day when Hamas attacked. Because those are teaching you. Even Hanukkah. The Jews don't claim Hanukkah because the Christians put it in their scriptures. But 9/11, the fifth dark day of Hanukkah, the religious calendar new year of the Jews, Black Friday, day after Thanksgiving. And Alma 30. People did observe to keep the commandments of the Lord, that they were strict in observing the ordinances of God according to the law of Moses. And they were taught to keep the law of Moses until it should be fulfilled. (31) Zoramites were dissenters from the Nephites. Therefore, they had had the word of God preached to them. And the Zoramites neglected the poor who lost their jobs after building the synagogue with the Rameumptom for the rich Zoramites who were farmers and thus were able to go to market and sell their goods. And so the unemployed carpenters aren't worth anything because they're not buying their products. So they were denied entrance into the synagogues with the Rameumptom to repeat the same prayer, "Oh God, we think thee that we are better than our brethren." And so, verse 9, they had fallen into great errors. They would not observe to keep the commandments of God and his statutes according to the law of Moses. Sodom was destroyed because they neglected the poor, not because of homosexuality. Helaman chapter 13. Nephites remain in wickedness, yea, in great wickedness, while the Lamanites did observe strictly to keep the commandments of God according to the law of Moses. Samuel the Lamanite, setting it up for him. And it came to pass that in that year there was one, Samuel, a Lamanite. Ta-da! And so, yes, a Mormon considered apostate by the white Nephites of Utah. There's a dualistic prophecy in this, by the way. Lamanites were black, as the Book of Mormon tells us. And so you're looking for your Christ, because Samuel is a type and shadow symbolism of the Messiah, of the Jews, and the learning of the Jews, which is the Mormon. It means name of God. El, God. Shem, name. Shemuel, Samuel. Same phonetics. And so the name of God, what's the name of God? Emmanuel. Comes to the Nephites at Zarahemla, the capital city of the Mormons in Utah, capital city, and gets on the internet wall in the first year. So the 80 and 6 years, 2017, and warns the Mormons, but he's an outsider. He's not born and raised in Utah. He starts his ministry in Utah. See what they did here? And so that's part of it. The other part of it is, yes, he does have descendancy from black slaves, raped, the teenage daughter raped by the slave master. And Helaman 15 to finish off the Book of Mormon about this. And we'll end here. We'll just have you refer to Deuteronomy, because I can do the same thing with Deuteronomy, going each and every single chapter. Bruce R. McConkie is a little misleading, but if you read it, you'll see where Bruce R. McConkie went wrong. He replaced the Jewish Christ with Jesus. That's your big clue. And so the more part of them are in their duty. And so, yeah, the Deuteronomy, it talks about being wanderers in the wilderness, and the pre-attempts to try to get into Zion to establish the New Jerusalem. And because the Salem already existed, it had been existing before even David Moses IV got there while vacationing in the midst of Armageddon 1. But that's another story that I've been doing videos for. And let's see. The more part of them are in the path of their duty. They do walk circumspectly before God and do observe to keep the commandments and his statutes and his judgments according to the law of Moses. So yeah, the whole Book of Mormon is trying to tell Mormons about the Jewish Christ. But because of Christian blinders put on them by Brigham Young and his Danites, who were the missionaries, who cooed Joseph's church and had him murdered. And I should point out to you, there was 2 people who tried to help Joseph Smith when in Carthage jail. 2 people. Joseph Smith was escorted by a group of men who I've identified as Danites. Not a single one of them stayed. Not a single one of them gave Joseph Smith and Hiram their pistols. They escorted them to the jail and then left. John Taylor and Willard Richards, they didn't have a gun. What were they doing there? They weren't arrested. What were they doing there? They were in Brigham Young's 12. What are they doing there? And then John Solomon Fulmer. He was with Joseph in the Nauvoo Legion. He also escorted Joseph Smith to the jail. He stayed. He intended to stay all that day. Joseph Smith told him some secrets that he didn't want Willard Richards or John Taylor to hear. Why are they there? And told him to go back and get the Nauvoo Legion to Nauvoo militia to come and help him, knowing that they wouldn't get there in time. And so John Solomon Fulmer gave Joseph Smith his single-shot pistol. He gave what he could. He wanted to stay. He was the only Mormon loyal to Joseph Smith. And for that loyalty, being the only Mormon who tried to defend and protect Joseph Smith, his descendant became the Mormon Christ, as he had to go with Brigham Young to make it happen, and take his sister Desdemona Fulmer with him, just as Hiram's wife, in order to fulfill prophecy of the Christ, had to go with Brigham Young. She was with Heber C. Kimball, so that her son Joseph Fielding Smith Sr. would be the other descendant that would merge with John Solomon Fulmer. And then there was a Wheelock who I don't think was Mormon, but he was a friend of John Taylor's. He came, didn't know the plot, and so he said, "Hey, have my 6-shooter." A person who's not even a Mormon knew that Joseph Smith's life was in danger and freely gave him his 6-shooter. Which then caused Willard Richards to go get some wine for the sacrament. He got a 6-shooter too. John Taylor and Willard Richards were there to make sure that they were murdered. Okay. So only those of you who get to the end of this video get the super sacred secret information, as the rest of Mormons were offended and left because they refused to believe.